The mahogany doors of the courtroom slammed shut, sealing the fate of everyone inside. On one side sat the Sterling family, billionaires, tycoons, the kind of people who owned half the city and leased the other half. On the other side sat Elara, a woman wearing a dress that looked 3 seasons old, her hands folded quietly in her lap. They called her a leech, a gold digger, a nobody who had trapped their son into a marriage he didn't want. They were there to strip her of everything, to leave her on the street with nothing but the clothes on her back. But as the judge opened the sealed envelope, the smirk on the family matriarch's face didn't just fade. It shattered. Because in the high-stakes game of wealth and power, the Sterlings forgot one thing: you never bet against the house. And Elara? She wasn't just a player. She was the owner of the casino. The funeral of Julian Sterling was exactly what Elara expected: cold, expensive, and entirely devoid of love. The rain in Seattle didn't drizzle. It hammered against the black umbrellas like accusation. Elara Vance, technically Elara Sterling, though no one in the family had ever addressed her by that name, stood at the edge of the grave. She wasn't crying. She had done her crying 3 months ago, the night she realized her husband wasn't just distant, but cruel. The accident that had taken his life 2 days ago felt less like a tragedy and more like an inevitable punctuation mark to a sentence that had run on too long. "Look at her," a voice hissed from beneath a nearby canopy. It was Victoria Sterling, Julian's mother, the matriarch of the Sterling shipping empire. She wore black velvet and diamonds that cost more than the house Elara grew up in. Not even a tear. She's probably calculating the inheritance right now. "She won't get a dime, Mother," whispered Arthur Sterling, Julian's younger brother. He was a man who wore Italian suits to hide the fact that he had no spine. "The prenup is ironclad. Julian told me he was going to file for divorce next week anyway. She's just a squatter in the estate now." Elara heard them. She had always had sharp hearing, a trait she learned to hide behind a curtain of thick, dark hair. She adjusted her coat, feeling the chill seep into her bones. She knew what they thought of her. To the Sterlings, she was the waitress Julian had picked up during a rebellious phase, a pretty face from a diner in nowhere, Idaho, who had somehow tricked their golden boy into a Las Vegas wedding. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that Julian hadn't picked her up. They didn't know that Julian had begged her. They didn't know about the nights he woke up screaming or the debt he had hidden from his mother. As the coffin was lowered, Victoria Sterling stepped forward, dropping a single white rose onto the wood. She turned, her eyes locking onto Elara with the precision of a sniper. She walked past Elara, pausing just long enough to whisper, "Enjoy the ride back to the manor, dear. It will be your last time inside." Elara didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her face a mask of calm porcelain. "We shall see, Victoria." The ride back to the Sterling estate, a sprawling Gothic mansion on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific, was silent. Elara sat in the back of the limousine alone. The driver, an old man named Henry, who was the only staff member who had ever smiled at her, looked at her through the rearview mirror with pity. "Are you all right, Mrs. Sterling?" Henry asked softly. "I'm fine, Henry," Elara said, looking out the window at the grey ocean. "Do you know if Mr. Blackwood is coming to the reading of the will tomorrow?" Henry frowned. "Mr. Blackwood? The family attorney?" "No, ma'am. Mr. Blackwood retired last year. The Sterlings are using a new firm now, Pendergrass and Associates. Vicious lawyers. They say Pendergrass could argue the devil into heaven." Elara's fingers tightened slightly on her purse. Pendergrass. She knew the name. They were corporate sharks. This wasn't going to be a standard reading of the will. This was going to be an execution. When she entered the manor, the staff avoided her gaze. The house was already being catalogued. She saw stickers on the vases in the hallway. Asset. Belfort Tutu. They were inventorying the house before the body was even cold. She walked up the grand staircase to the master bedroom. She opened the door and looked at the empty bed. On the nightstand, a picture of Julian smiled back, the fake, charming smile he used for investors. She walked to the closet and pulled out a small, battered leather suitcase. It was the same suitcase she had brought with her 2 years ago. She didn't pack clothes. She reached into the lining of the suitcase, pulled out a small silver key, and walked to the heavy oak desk in the corner of the room. Inside the bottom drawer was a false bottom. She pried it open. Inside lay a single document, yellowed with age, and a velvet pouch. "I gave you a chance, Julian," she whispered to the empty room. "I gave you every chance to be a good man." She slipped the document and the pouch into her jacket pocket. Downstairs, she could hear the clinking of crystal glasses. The Sterlings were drinking to Julian's memory, but mostly they were drinking to the future, a future they believed belonged solely to them. The following morning, the library of the Sterling Manor smelled of old paper and expensive cologne. Victoria Sterling sat behind the massive desk that had belonged to her late husband and then her son. Arthur stood by the window, looking bored. In the center of the room sat Marcus Pendergrass, the lawyer. He was a man who looked like he was carved out of grease and malice. Ilara entered the room. She wore a simple navy blouse and black slacks. No jewelry, no makeup. "Sit," Victoria commanded, not looking up from her papers. Ilara took the seat opposite the desk. Marcus Pendergrass cleared his throat. He didn't open a file. He simply folded his hands on the table. "Mrs. Sterling, let's not waste time. We all know the reality of this marriage. It was impulsive. Julian was not in his right mind." "Julian was perfectly sane when he proposed," Ilara said, her voice steady. "Please," Arthur scoffed from the window. "He was drunk on cheap tequila and lust. You caught him at a low point." Pendergrass held up a hand to silence Arthur. "Regardless of the romantic details, the financial reality is this. The prenuptial agreement you signed entitles you to a lump sum of $10,000 for every year of marriage. You were married for 2 years. That is $20,000. He slid a check across the table. It was made out for $50,000. "Victoria is generous," Pendergrass said with an oily smile. "She has rounded it up to 50,000. Consider it a severance package, a thank you for your services." Ilara looked at the check. She didn't touch it. "And the house? The shares in Sterling Shipping?" Victoria laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. "The house? This house has been in my family for 4 generations. You think you can walk in here from a trailer park and take Blackwood Manor? And the company? You have no education, no background, no breeding. You are a waitress, Ilara." "I read the will," Pendergrass continued, his voice dropping an octave. "Julian left everything to the family trust, controlled by Victoria. You are not mentioned. Not once. In fact, Julian filed an amendment 3 weeks ago, specifically excluding you from any spousal support." Ilara remained motionless. "He excluded me?" "Explicitly," Pendergrass said, enjoying this. "He realized his mistake. He wanted you gone. Now you can take this check, sign this non-disclosure agreement, and disappear back to Idaho. Or, Ilara asked. "Or we go to court," Pendergrass said, his eyes hardening. "And if we go to court, I will destroy you. I will paint you as an abuser, a manipulator, and a fraud. I will drag your family's name, what little there is of it, through the mud. You will leave with nothing, not even your dignity." The room went silent. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly. Ilara reached out and took the check. Victoria smirked. Arthur chuckled. They had won. It was so easy. Ilara looked at the check, then slowly, methodically, tore it down the middle. Then she tore it again. She let the pieces flutter onto the mahogany desk like confetti. Victoria stood up, her face turning red. "You ungrateful little—" "I don't want your charity, Victoria," Ilara said, standing up. She didn't look small anymore. She looked tall, dangerous. "And I don't want the 50,000. "Then you get nothing," Arthur yelled. "Get out! I'll have security throw you out." "You can try," Ilara said calmly, "but I suggest you save your energy for the hearing on Friday. You're going to need it." "The hearing?" Pendergrass laughed. "You don't even have a lawyer. Who is going to represent you? Legal aid?" Ilara walked to the door. She paused, her hand on the brass knob. She turned back, and for the first time, a small, cold smile played on her lips. "My lawyer has already filed the paperwork, Mr. Pendergrass. His name is Silas Vane." The color drained from Pendergrass's face instantly. Even Victoria froze. "Silas Vane?" Pendergrass stuttered. The corporate reaper. He doesn't take divorce cases. He only handles billion-dollar mergers and international sovereignty disputes. He costs $5,000 an hour." "Does he?" Ilara mused. "I wouldn't know. He didn't charge me." "Why would Silas Vane represent you?" Victoria demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and sudden fear. "Because," Ilara said softly, opening the door, "he owes my father a favor." She stepped out and closed the door, leaving the three of them in a silence that was far heavier than the one she had found. "Her father?" Arthur asked, breaking the silence. "I thought her father was a truck driver." Pendergrass was already on his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed a number. "We need to pull her file again. Deep background. Now. Something isn't right. Silas Vane doesn't get out of bed for anything less than an empire." Victoria sank back into her chair, staring at the torn pieces of the check. For the first time in 20 years, she felt a shiver of genuine fear crawl up her spine. Friday arrived with a storm that made the funeral look like a sunny day. The King County Superior Court was packed. The press had gotten wind of the Sterling showdown, as they called it. A billionaire family versus the destitute widow. It was prime-time drama. Victoria Sterling arrived with an entourage of 5 lawyers, led by Pendergrass. She wore white, projecting an image of purity and grieving motherhood. She played to the cameras, dabbing at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Ilara arrived alone. She stepped out of a black sedan. She wore a tailored black suit that fit her differently than her usual clothes. It was sharp, angular, and expensive. She walked past the paparazzi without acknowledging them. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick. Judge Harrison Thorne presided. He was a no-nonsense judge, known for favoring established families and old money. The Sterlings were relaxed. They knew Thorne. They played golf at the same club. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Thorne took his seat. "We are here for the probate hearing of the estate of Julian Sterling. The family is contesting the widow's claim to, well, anything, it seems." Pendergrass stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, this is a simple case. We have a prenuptial agreement. We have a last will and testament. The plaintiff, Mrs. Ilara Sterling, is attempting to extort the family for a settlement. She has no claim to the Sterling shipping empire, which has been in the family for 80 years. "I see," Judge Thorne said, looking over his glasses at Ilara. "And who is representing the widow?" I see she is sitting alone. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a heavy thud. The room turned. Walking down the aisle was a man who looked like he had been cut from granite. He was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair and a suit that cost more than the judge's annual salary. He carried a single thin briefcase. It was Silas Vane. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Lawyers whispered to each other. Why was he here? Silas Vane was a myth. He was the man corporations called when they wanted to buy a country, not settle a probate case. Vane walked through the gate and took the seat next to Ilara. He didn't look at the Sterlings. He didn't look at the judge. He opened his briefcase and placed a single fountain pen on the table. Silas Vane, representing Mrs. Ilara Vance Sterling, he said. His voice was deep, resonant, and filled the room without him shouting. Mr. Vane, Judge Thorne said, clearly surprised. I wasn't aware you handled domestic probate. I don't, Your Honor, Vane said. But this is not a domestic probate case. This is a matter of corporate theft and fraud. Objection, Pendergrass shouted, jumping up. Fraud? This is a grieving mother protecting her son's legacy. Sit down, Mr. Pendergrass, Vane said, not even looking at him. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Pendergrass blinked, stunned, and slowly sat. Vane stood up and turned to the gallery, then to the judge. Your Honor, the Sterling family claims that Ilara Sterling is a gold digger. They claim she brought nothing to this marriage. They claim she is entitled to nothing because the assets belong to the Sterling Trust. That is correct, Judge Thorne said. The defense presents Exhibit A, Vane said, handing a document to the bailiff. The original land deeds for the Port of Seattle, Terminal 4 through 9, where Sterling Shipping conducts 90% of its business. Pendergrass frowned. We own those terminals. My client's grandfather bought them in 1945. Read the deed, Your Honor, Vane said. Judge Thorne put on his spectacles. He read the document. He paused, he squinted, and read it again. He looked up at the Sterlings, then at Vane. This deed, it says the land is not owned. It is leased. Leased, Victoria hissed. That's impossible. We own the land. Leased for a period of 99 years, Vane continued calmly. Starting in 1925, the lease was signed by Archibald Sterling. And who is the lessor? Judge Thorne asked. Who owns the land? Vane pointed a finger at the woman sitting quietly beside him. The land is owned by the Vance estate. Ilara Vance is the sole living heir. The courtroom exploded. The silence in the courtroom was shattered by Victoria Sterling's screech. Liar! That is a forgery! She stood up, her perfectly manicured hands slamming onto the table. The Vances are nobodies. Her father was a mechanic in a dusty town in Idaho. He fixed tractors. Silas Vane didn't even blink. He turned a page in his file, the sound crisp and loud in the quiet room. James Vance was indeed a mechanic. He enjoyed fixing things. It was his hobby. But he was also the grandson of Elias Vance, the copper baron who owned most of the Pacific Northwest before the Great Depression. The Vances didn't lose their money, Mrs. Sterling. They just went private. Judge Thorne was reading the deed with a magnifying glass. Mr. Pendergrass, the judge said, his voice dangerously low. This deed is registered with the State Archives. It bears the seal of the Department of Interior. It appears genuine. Pendergrass was sweating now. He loosened his tie. Your Honor, even if, and that is a massive if, the land was leased. A lease is a contract. We have squatters' rights, adverse possession. We have operated on that land for 80 years. Adverse possession requires hostile occupation. Vane countered smoothly. But you paid rent. You acknowledged the owner. We never paid rent to her, Arthur shouted. No, Vane said. You paid it to a shell corporation called Apex Holdings. Does that name sound familiar, Arthur? Arthur went pale. Apex. That's the account we send the annual land use fee to. It's a nominal fee. $1 a year. Exactly. Vane smiled, but it was a predator's smile. A 99-year lease for $1 a year, signed in 1925 between your grandfather and hers. A gesture of friendship. But there was a clause. Vane pulled another document from his briefcase. This one looked newer. Clause 14, Section B, Vane read aloud. Upon the expiration of the 99-year term, or upon the death of the male heir of the Sterling line, the lease agreement shall be subject to immediate renegotiation. If no agreement is reached within 48 hours, all improvements on the land, including cranes, warehouses, dry docks and corporate offices, revert to the ownership of the landholder. Vane looked up. The lease expired yesterday at midnight, and Julian Sterling, the male heir, is dead. You are currently trespassing on Mrs. Sterling's property. The gallery began to whisper. Reporters were typing furiously on their phones. The narrative had flipped instantly. The Sterlings weren't kicking a poor widow out. They were squatting on a billionaire heiress's land. Victoria sank into a chair. She looked at Elara, really looked at her, for the first time. You knew, she hissed. You knew this whole time. Why didn't you say anything? Why did you let us treat you like trash? Elara turned her head slowly. Her eyes were dry and hard. Because I wanted to see if you were capable of love, Victoria. I wanted to see if you loved Julian, or if you just loved the Empire. And when Julian died, I wanted to see if you would treat his widow with kindness, or if you would try to destroy her. She leaned forward. You failed every test. This is entrapment, Pendergrass yelled, desperate now. You can't just take the company. The value of the infrastructure is billions. And the rent is due, Vane said. My client is willing to negotiate a new lease. Fine, Victoria spat. How much? We'll pay whatever the market rate is. $1 million a year? 5 million? Vane closed his file. The price isn't money, Mrs. Sterling. Not money? Arthur asked, his voice trembling. Then what? We'll get to the price, Elara said, speaking up. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a gavel. But first, we need to discuss why Julian died. The courtroom went deadly silent. Objection! Pendergrass screamed. Relevance. Julian died in a car accident. It was a tragedy, but it has nothing to do with the probate. It has everything to do with it, Vane interjected. Your Honor, we would like to submit Exhibit C into evidence, the contents of the deceased's private safe. He held up the velvet pouch Elara had retrieved from the desk. Julian didn't just crash, Elara said, standing up and walking toward the witness stand. She didn't sit. She just stood near the rail. He was driving too fast because he was terrified. He was running away from you, Victoria. Elara opened the pouch and pulled out a small, digital voice recorder. Julian found out about the lease 3 months ago, Elara told the court. He found the old papers in the attic. He realized that the entire Sterling fortune was built on sand. My sand. He came to me. He was crying. He told me he loved me. But he was scared of what you would do if you found out who I really was. She pressed play on the recorder. Julian's voice, shaky and slurred with alcohol, filled the room. Mother is pushing me to file the divorce. She says Elara is dead weight. She doesn't know. God, if she finds out Elara owns the port, she'll do something crazy. Arthur is already cooking the books. They're bypassing safety checks on the tankers to save money for the divorce lawyers. They're going to get people killed. I can't do this anymore. I have to tell Elara. I have to warn her. The recording clicked off. Victoria's face was a mask of horror. Not guilt, horror at being exposed. That voice is AI, Arthur shouted. That's deep fake. We have the metadata, Vane said calmly. Recorded 3 hours before the crash. But the interesting part is the mention of safety checks. You see, Judge, Clause 14 wasn't the only termination clause. Clause 18 states, any illegal activity or gross negligence conducted on the leased land results in immediate forfeiture of the lease. Vane pulled out a stack of photos. These are photos of the hulls of the Sterling fleet, taken by a private investigator last week. Cracks in the hull, rusted reinforcements. You've been sending ships out that are floating coffins to save money on maintenance. That is criminal negligence. Judge Thorne looked at the photos. His face darkened. He looked at Victoria Sterling with undisguised disgust. Mrs. Sterling, the judge said, is this true? Did you authorize the reduction in maintenance budgets? Victoria stayed silent. Her lips were a thin white line. I did, Arthur whispered. Everyone turned to him. He looked like he was about to vomit. Mother told me to. She said we needed to hoard cash in case Elara fought the prenup. She said we needed a war chest to destroy her. The betrayal was complete. The family had eaten itself alive. Elara looked at them with pity. You destroyed your own ships, your own company, and your own son, just to save money to fight a war that didn't exist. I never wanted your money, Victoria. I have more money in my trust fund than your company has made in 20 years. The silence that followed Arthur Sterling's confession was heavy enough to crush a lung. In the gallery, the reporters were practically vibrating, their fingers flying across phone screens, broadcasting the collapse of a dynasty in real time. Arthur Sterling admits to fraud. Sterling Shipping, operating floating coffins. The headlines were writing themselves. Judge Harrison Thorne stared at the defense table. He was a man who had seen everything in his 30 years on the bench. Murderers, cartel bosses, corrupt politicians. But the look of disgust on his face as he regarded Victoria Sterling was new. It was absolute. Let the record show, Judge Thorne said, his voice dangerously low, that Mr. Arthur Sterling has admitted, under oath, to the intentional falsification of safety records and the misappropriation of corporate funds. Your Honor! Marcus Pendergrass jumped up, his face glistening with sweat. He looked like a man trying to hold back a tsunami with a paper shield. My client is under extreme duress. He is grieving. This testimony it's confused. We move to strike. Sit down, Mr. Pendergrass, Thorne barked. The gavel didn't bang. It slammed like a gunshot, making half the room jump. The witness was lucid. The evidence provided by the plaintiff supports his statement. And frankly, looking at the photos of those rusted hulls, confused is the last word I would use. Criminal seems more appropriate. The judge turned his gaze to Silas Vane. Mr. Vane, regarding the motion to enforce the lease expiration. Silas Vane stood up. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat. He simply buttoned his jacket with the air of an executioner checking his blade. The lease expired at midnight, Your Honor. Furthermore, Clause 18 is clear. Gross negligence voids any holdover protections. The Sterlings are currently operating an illegal enterprise on land owned by the Vance estate. We ask for immediate relief. Judge Thorne nodded, scribbling furiously on his notepad. He looked up, removing his glasses. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Elara Vance Sterling. The lease agreement of 1925 is valid, expired, and was breached by the lessee. He looked directly at Victoria. The motion to evict Sterling Shipping from the Port of Seattle, Terminals 4 through 9, is granted immediately. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. All infrastructure attached to the land, cranes, warehouses, administrative buildings, is now the property of the landowner. You can't do this, Victoria screamed. She lost it. The mask of the composure finally shattered. She lunged toward the bench, her diamond bracelets clattering against the wood of the table as her lawyers held her back. That is my company. My father built those docks. You can't just take them because of some dusty piece of paper. I didn't take them, Mrs. Sterling, Judge Thorne said coldly. You lost them. By being cheap, by being arrogant, and by underestimating the terms of your own contract. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck one final time. The hallway of ruin. The chaos that erupted was immediate. But the real drama happened 10 minutes later in the private conference room adjacent to the courtroom. The Sterlings had retreated there to regroup, but it felt more like a bunker under siege. Victoria was pacing the small room, hyperventilating. Arthur was sitting in the corner, head in his hands, rocking back and forth. Pendergrass was on the phone, screaming at someone in his office. "What do you mean the stock is halted?" Pendergrass yelled into his cell. "Get the PR team. Spin it. Tell them it's a clerical error." He slammed the phone down and turned to Victoria. "The New York Stock Exchange just halted trading on Sterling Global. The stock dropped 40% in 10 minutes. The shareholders are calling for blood." "Fix it, Marcus!" Victoria shrieked. "File an appeal. Get an injunction. Stop the eviction." "I can't!" Pendergrass shouted back, losing his professional veneer. "Don't you understand? It's a property law ruling. It's black and white. Vane has the deed. Until an appeal is heard, which could take months, you are locked out." "So?" Victoria snapped. "We operate from the headquarters downtown." "Operate what, Victoria?" Pendergrass asked, his voice trembling with the magnitude of the disaster. "The ships need to dock to unload. They can't dock at your terminals because you don't own them anymore. If you divert them to Tacoma or Oakland, the delay fees will bankrupt you in a week. And the cranes, the warehouses, they belong to her now. You have ships full of cargo and no way to get it off the boats." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Every day you are locked out, the company loses $50 million in revenue. By Tuesday, you won't be able to make payroll. By Friday, the creditors will seize the fleet." Victoria sank into a chair. For the first time in her life, the math didn't work in her favor. She looked small, old. The door to the conference room opened. It wasn't the bailiff. It was Alara. She walked in alone. Silas Vane waited by the door, leaning against the frame, watching. Alara closed the door behind her. The sound of the latch clicking shut was deafening in the small room. "Get out," Victoria hissed, though the fire in her voice was dying. "Haven't you done enough?" Alara walked over to the opposite side of the table. She placed her hands on the back of a chair and looked down at the woman who had made her life a living hell for 2 years. "I haven't done anything yet, Victoria," Alara said calmly. "I just read the contract. You're the one who violated it." "What do you want?" Arthur moaned from the corner. "You want money? Is that it? You want to pay off?" "I told you in the beginning," Alara said, ignoring Arthur and keeping her eyes locked on Victoria. "I tried to negotiate. You tore up the check. You laughed at me." "I'll pay you," Victoria said quickly, desperation creeping into her tone. "We'll negotiate a new lease. Right now. I'll pay double the market rate. 10 million a year. 20 million. "The lease isn't for sale," Alara said. "Then what?" Victoria demanded. "Shares? I'll give you 20% of the company. You'll be a billionaire. You can go back to Idaho and live like a queen." Alara laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "You still don't get it. You think this is about money. You think everyone is like you." She pulled a chair out and sat down. "I don't want your money, Victoria. I have my own. The Vance Trust has been quietly investing in tech and renewable energy for 50 years. I have more liquidity in my personal checking account than Sterling Shipping has in its reserves right now." Victoria's eyes widened. "Then, why? Why did you work at that diner? Why did you let us treat you like a pauper?" "Because I wanted to make it on my own," Elara said, leaning forward. "And because I was studying you." "Studying me?" "I have a master's degree in global logistics from Stanford, Victoria," Elara revealed. The room went silent. "I used my mother's maiden name at university. I was working at that diner near the port because I was writing my thesis on supply chain inefficiencies in the Pacific Northwest. I was researching your company. I knew Sterling Shipping was rotting from the inside out before I even met Julian." Victoria looked like she had been slapped. The waitress she had mocked was more qualified than her entire board of directors. "I fell in love with Julian because he was kind," Elara continued, her voice softening for a fraction of a second before hardening again. "But I stayed because I thought I could help him fix this family. But you broke him before I could save him." Elara slid a folder across the table. "Here is the price for the new lease." Victoria opened the folder with trembling hands. She read the first page, her face drained of all color. This is a resignation letter." "2 resignation letters," Elara corrected. "One for you, one for Arthur, effective immediately. You resign from the board of directors. You surrender your voting rights. You hand over the CEO position." "To whom?" Victoria whispered. "To me," Elara said. "You can't be serious," Pendergrass scoffed, trying to regain some ground. "The board will never approve a hostile takeover by the widow." "The board doesn't have a choice," Elara said, looking at the lawyer. "Because if they don't accept my terms, I don't sign a new lease. The port stays closed. The company goes bankrupt in 4 days. The stock goes to zero. The board members lose their investments, their pensions, everything. They will vote for me to save their own skins." She looked back at Victoria. "And there's one more thing. The house." "The manor?" Victoria gasped. "That is my home. It has nothing to do with the business." "Check the deed, Victoria," Elara said coldly. "The Blackwood Manor sits on Parcel 4B. It was part of the original land grant in 1925. It's on my land. You're evicted from there, too." Arthur began to sob loudly. "We're homeless. You're making us homeless." "You have 3 other vacation homes in Europe," Elara said, dismissing his pity party. "You won't be on the street, but you will not live in my house, and you will not run my company." "And if I refuse?" Victoria asked, her voice barely a whisper. She was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. "If I refuse to sign?" Elara nodded to Silas Vane. Silas stepped forward and placed a second document on the table. It was a criminal complaint, drafted and ready to be filed. "If you refuse," Silas said, his voice deep and final, "we hand over Arthur's confession and the recordings to the district attorney. The charges will be corporate fraud, reckless endangerment, and involuntary manslaughter regarding the death of the 3 dock workers last year due to equipment failure. The mandatory minimum sentence is 15 years. Victoria looked at the criminal complaint. Then she looked at Arthur, who was looking back at her with sheer terror. He was weak, useless, and pathetic, but he was her son. The only one she had left. "You would send him to prison?" Victoria asked Elara. "He was Julian's brother." "You sent Julian to his death to save a few dollars," Elara countered, her eyes burning. "Don't talk to me about family loyalty. Sign the papers, Victoria, or Arthur goes to jail, and you go down as the woman who destroyed the Sterling legacy. The room was silent for a long minute. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall and Arthur's ragged breathing. Victoria picked up the pen. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy and expensive, a symbol of the power she had wielded for 40 years. She looked at it as if it were a foreign object. She looked at Elara one last time. "You will fail," she spat. "They will eat you alive. The shipping industry is a men's club. They won't respect you." "They don't have to respect me," Elara said, standing up and smoothing her jacket. "They just have to pay me rent." Victoria pressed the pen to the paper. Her signature was shaky, a jagged scrawl that looked nothing like the confident autograph she had signed on billion-dollar contracts for decades. She signed the resignation, then she signed the deed transfer. She dropped the pen. It rolled across the table and fell onto the floor with a hollow clack. "Done," Victoria whispered. She looked hollowed out. The imperious queen was gone, replaced by an old woman in a chair that was suddenly too big for her. Elara reached out and took the folder. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just nodded. "You have until 6 p.m. to vacate the office," Elara said, "and until noon tomorrow to clear out of the manor. Take only personal items. If you take a single piece of corporate art or furniture, I'll have you arrested for theft." She turned and walked toward the door. Silas opened it for her. "Elara," Arthur called out, his voice cracking. What happens to us now?" Elara paused in the doorway. She looked back at the family that had tried to erase her. "I suggest you do what I did, Arthur," she said. "Start over. And maybe this time, try being kind. It costs a lot less than being cruel." She stepped out into the hallway, leaving the Sterlings in the wreckage of their own hubris. The air in the corridor tasted different. It tasted clean. It tasted like victory. The transition of power at the Sterling Empire did not happen with a whisper. It happened with the force of a tectonic shift. 72 hours after the gavel fell in Judge Thorne's courtroom, the atmosphere inside the Sterling Global Headquarters, a monolith of black glass and steel piercing the Seattle skyline, was suffocating. The employees walked on eggshells. The whispers in the break rooms were frantic. Was there a kill list? Who was getting fired? Was the company dissolving? Elara stood in the lobby of the building that had once forbidden her entry without an escort. She wasn't wearing the faded cardigans the staff remembered her in. She was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, sharp enough to cut glass, and her hair was pulled back in a severe, commanding bun. Beside her stood Silas Vane, looking like the grim reaper of corporate law, and a team of 6 forensic accountants she had flown in from New York. Mrs. Sterling, the head of security, a burly man named Miller, stammered as he approached. He had once physically blocked her from seeing Julian. Now he looked ready to kneel. We didn't expect you until noon. The executive elevator is being prepped." "I'm not Mrs. Sterling anymore, Miller," Elara said, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "And I don't need the elevator prepped. I know how to push a button." She walked past him, her heels clicking a rhythm of war on the floor. "Lock down the server rooms," she commanded over her shoulder. "No data leaves this building. If I find a single email deleted, you're fired for cause." Miller scrambled to his radio. "Lock it down. Now." The boardroom bloodbath. The elevator ride to the 40th floor was silent. When the doors opened, the reception area was chaotic. Secretaries were shredding papers. Junior executives were packing boxes. Elara walked straight into the main boardroom. The remaining board members, 12 men who had watched Victoria Sterling run the company into the ground while lining their own pockets, were seated, looking terrified. At the head of the table, Victoria's chair sat empty. Elara didn't take the head chair. She remained standing, placing her hands flat on the mahogany table. "Gentlemen," she began, her gaze sweeping over them. "By now you've heard the news. The lease has been renegotiated. The land, the infrastructure, and the controlling interest of this company now belong to the Vance estate." "Mrs. Ilara," spoke up George Gregson, the CFO. He was a greasy man who had sneered at her at the wedding. "We understand there is a transition, but we must be practical. You have no experience running a logistics conglomerate. The shareholders are panicking. The stock is down 12% this morning. We suggest you let us form an emergency steering committee while you settle in." Ilara smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "George," she said softly, "do you remember the Christmas party 2 years ago? You told me I should stick to the buffet because the men were talking business." Gregson turned a shade of pale, usually reserved for corpses. "Aye. That was a joke." "Here is a joke," Ilara said, pulling a file from Silas Vane's briefcase. "The Neptune Initiative." The room went deathly still. "I spent the last 48 hours reviewing the encrypted ledgers my husband hid in the cloud," Ilara continued, tossing the file onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of Gregson. "You and Arthur have been funneling maintenance budget into shell companies in the Cayman Islands. You categorized it as consulting fees. You stole $40 million from the safety budget while our ships were rusting in the water." That is preposterous," Gregson sputtered, sweating profusely. "It's a felony," Ilara corrected. "The forensic accountants downstairs are already tracing the wire transfers. The FBI is waiting in the lobby, George. You're not on a steering committee. You're under arrest." 2 federal agents stepped into the room. Gregson stood up, his legs shaking, and was handcuffed in front of his colleagues. As he was dragged out, protesting weakly, the silence in the room was absolute. Ilara looked at the remaining 11 members. "Anyone else want to question my experience? Or should we discuss the Q3 logistics reports?" No one spoke. "Good," Ilara said, finally taking the seat at the head of the table. "You all serve at my pleasure now, and my pleasure is efficiency. We have a lot of work to do." The eviction of the matriarch. 2 floors up, in the penthouse suite that served as the CEO's office, the air was toxic. Victoria Sterling was not leaving quietly. She was frantically shoving items into boxes, awards, gold-plated statues, files. She looked disheveled, her perfect hair fraying at the edges, her eyes wild with the panic of a trapped animal. Arthur sat on the leather sofa, his head in his hands, sobbing quietly. "Stop crying, Arthur," Victoria snapped, throwing a heavy crystal decanter into a box. "We need to salvage what we can. The accounts are frozen. We need assets." "It's over, Mother," Arthur moaned. "She won. She has the leverage. If we don't leave, she sends the evidence to the DA. "She's a bluffing little waitress," Victoria screamed, grabbing a painting off the wall, an original Monet. "She wouldn't dare send the father of her late husband to jail." "Try me," a voice said from the doorway. Victoria froze. She turned slowly to see Ilara leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Put the painting back, Victoria," Ilara said calmly. "It's listed as corporate property. Taking it is theft." "I bought this," Victoria hissed, clutching the frame. "I bought it with my money." "You bought it with company funds," Ilara corrected. "I saw the receipt. Put it back." Victoria hesitated, her knuckles white. For a second, Ilara thought the older woman might attack her. Then, with a scream of frustration, Victoria slammed the painting onto the floor. The frame cracked. "You think you've won?" Victoria spat, stepping over the debris. "You think you can replace me? I built this family. I kept this company alive through 3 recessions." "You cannibalized this company," Ilara said, walking into the room. You fed on its bones to buy jewelry and influence. You didn't build a legacy, Victoria. You built a facade, and you killed your son to maintain it. I didn't kill him. You drove him to that car. Elara's voice rose, cracking with the first sign of emotion she had shown all day. You made him feel so small, so trapped, that he felt his only way out was to speed down a rainy highway to warn me about you. His blood is on your hands. Victoria flinched. She slumped back against the desk, the fight draining out of her. What happens to us? Arthur asked, looking up with red, swollen eyes. Are we homeless? Elara looked at her brother-in-law. He was weak, yes, but he was also a victim of Victoria's tyranny, just as Julian had been. I'm not a monster, Arthur, Elara said, her voice softening slightly. I've arranged for the deed to the lake house in Montana to be transferred to your name. It's small, isolated, and quiet. You can live there, but you are banned from any Vance properties in the city. You have a monthly stipend of $3,000. If you want more, get a job. 3,000, Victoria gasped. That won't even cover my facial treatments. Then I suggest you learn to age gracefully, Elara said coldly. Security will escort you out. You have 10 minutes. She turned to leave, but stopped. Oh, and Victoria? The old woman looked up, hatred burning in her eyes. Leave the pearls, Elara said. Julian gave them to you for his 30th birthday. You never wore them because you said they were cheap. I'll take them back now. With trembling hands, Victoria unclasped the necklace and dropped it onto the desk. Elara picked it up, feeling the cool weight of the pearls, a symbol of Julian's love that had been rejected. She put them in her pocket and walked out, leaving the former Queen of Seattle to weep in the ruins of her own making. The test on the docks' power in the boardroom was one thing, power on the docks was another. 3 days later, a crisis erupted. The Vance Titan, a massive cargo ship carrying $200 million in electronics, was stuck in Dry Dock 4. The unionized dock workers were refusing to work on it. They claimed the equipment was unsafe. Pendergrass, who was desperately trying to sue for wrongful termination of the lease and failing, had leaked rumors that Elara was going to slash pensions to pay for the hostile takeover. The workers were angry. It was raining, a torrential downpour that turned the shipyard into a grey, industrial hellscape. Elara's advisors told her to stay in the tower. Send a negotiator, they said. It's too dangerous. They're riled up. Elara ignored them. She put on a hard hat, a high-visibility jacket over her suit, and drove straight to Terminal 4. When she arrived, 200 men were standing by the gates, holding signs. The atmosphere was volatile. The foreman, a giant of a man named Big Mike Kowalski, stepped forward as Elara got out of the car. "Go back to the penthouse, princess," someone shouted from the crowd. "We don't want your charity." Big Mike crossed his arms. "You shouldn't be here, Mrs. Sterling. The boys are angry. We haven't had a safety audit in 2 years. We're not touching that ship until we get guarantees." Elara walked right up to him. She had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but she didn't wipe it away. "It's Miss Vance," she said, her voice projecting clearly over the sound of the rain. "And I'm not here to give you charity. I'm here to tell you you're right." The crowd quieted down, confused. "I've seen the logs," Elara shouted, turning to address the group. "The hydraulic winch on Crane 7 is shot. The hull reinforcement on the Titan is 3 years past due. You're right to refuse work. If I were you, I wouldn't step foot on that deck either." She turned back to Mike. "I approved a purchase order this morning. $5 million for new hydraulics. Siemens brand, top of the line. They arrive tomorrow morning. Until then, No one works on the heavy machinery. You get full pay for the downtime. Mike squinted at her, suspicious. Full pay for sitting on our asses? Victoria Sterling would have fired us for even suggesting it. Victoria Sterling isn't signing the checks anymore, Ilara said. I am. And I know that a dead worker costs a lot more than a delayed shipment. But I need something from you, Mike. Yeah? What's that? I need this ship moving in 48 hours once those parts are installed. I need you to pull a double shift. Triple-time pay for overtime. Can you do that? Mike looked at her. He looked at the determination in her eyes, the lack of fear. He looked at the mud splashing on her expensive shoes. She wasn't hiding in the tower. She was down here in the muck. Slowly, a grin spread across his bearded face. He extended a hand the size of a baseball mitt. You get us the parts, Miss Vance, and we'll get this tub to Tokyo ahead of schedule. Ilara shook his hand. Deal. As she walked back to the car, a cheer went up from the men. It wasn't polite applause. It was the roar of respect. She had won the army. The final goodbye. 2 weeks later, the dust had settled. The stock had rebounded and was climbing higher than it ever had under Victoria. The rebrand was complete. Vance Sterling Global was now the undisputed king of the Pacific trade routes. It was late evening. The office was quiet. Ilara sat at the desk that was now cluttered with schematics, union contracts, and sustainability reports. She was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind that came from building something real. Silas Vane knocked softly on the open door. The helicopter is ready, Ilara. Are you heading home? Ilara spun her chair around to look out the window. In a minute, Silas. Did Arthur sign the papers for the Montana house? He did. He asked if he could keep the company car. I told him no. Ilara chuckled. Good. He needs to learn to take the bus. You saved them, you know, Silas said, stepping into the room. In a way. You stopped them from committing more crimes. You gave them an out. Most people would have destroyed them completely. I didn't do it for them, Ilara said quietly. I did it for Julian. He loved them, despite everything. I couldn't destroy the people he loved, even if they hated me. She stood up and walked to the window. Her reflection stared back, stronger, older, wiser. Silas, I want to set up a foundation, the Julian Sterling Scholarship. For business students? Silas asked, taking out his notepad. No, Ilara said. For mechanics, for people who like to fix things, for the people who keep the world moving but never get the credit. Full rides, trade schools, engineering programs. I want his name to mean something good again. Consider it done, Silas said, closing his notebook. You're a good woman, Ilara. I'm a busy woman, Silas, she smiled. The final scene wasn't in a boardroom or a courtroom. It was at a quiet grave on a hill overlooking the sea. Ilara knelt in the grass. The tombstone read, Julian Sterling. Below it, she had added a new inscription. Beloved husband. He tried. She placed the string of pearls she had taken back from Victoria on the headstone. I did it, Julian, she whispered to the wind. I took it back. The ships are safe. The workers are happy. Your mother can't hurt anyone anymore. She touched the cold stone. I wish you were here to see it. You would have liked the new logo. It's blue. Like your eyes. She stood up, brushing the grass from her knees. The wind whipped her coat around her legs. She didn't feel the cold anymore. She felt the fire of ambition, the warmth of justice, and the heavy, satisfying weight of responsibility. She turned and walked back toward the waiting car. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from the governor of Washington. He wanted to discuss a new trade initiative. Elara Vance checked her reflection in the car window, adjusted her collar, and smiled. The morning was over. The rain had begun, and that is how Elara Vance went from a despised widow facing homelessness to the CEO of the largest shipping empire on the West Coast. The Sterlings thought they were playing a game of chess against a pawn, never realizing they were sitting across from the Queen. Victoria Sterling learned the hard way that arrogance is the most expensive luxury of all, and it cost her everything. Elara proved that true power doesn't come from the name you are born with, or the money in your bank account, but from your character, your intelligence, and your resilience. She turned her pain into power and her grief into an empire. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story about underdogs taking back what's theirs. Share this video with a friend who needs a reminder that the truth always wins in the end. Thanks for watching.